When a forgotten royal memo penned by Queen Elizabeth herself suddenly surfaced, no one expected it would lead to Camilla being blocked from an international stage. But Prince William didn't hesitate. What did the Queen write that forced her grandson to defy tradition and protect the crown? It began with an envelope yellowing at the edges, marked "Private Eyes Only" in the Queen's unmistakable handwriting. Hidden deep within the royal archives, it was supposed to remain sealed until a far-off date. But somehow, it didn't. Just days before one of the monarchy's most anticipated appearances on the world stage, a high-profile international summit with global leaders, the document was leaked to an inner-circle aide. Within hours, the contents rippled through the palace like an earthquake no one was prepared for. The monarch's words, written long before her passing, carried a chilling weight that could not be ignored. The memo, dated nearly 2 years before her death, wasn't a public decree, nor was it listed in any official briefing. But it was undeniably hers, and its tone was striking. In a calm but resolute voice, the Queen expressed deep unease about future royal representation, particularly naming Camilla in a context that was both sobering and suspicious. The former monarch spoke of optics that may fracture the trust the public places in us, and noted a continued concern about alignment with traditional values in international diplomacy. It was clear these were not casual observations. They were warnings. The leak's timing was no accident. With global eyes about to descend on the royal family, the palace had meticulously prepared the public face of the monarchy. But this new revelation ignited a private inferno behind the walls of Windsor. A hush order was immediately issued. Senior aides were summoned to a midnight meeting. The summit's media team was silenced. Phones were confiscated. Every trace of the memo's existence was to be buried again. But it was too late. One name had already seen it, and one heir understood the storm that was about to break. Prince William was informed just hours before the official summit announcement was scheduled to be released. The memo was placed in his hands with a simple phrase, "She wrote this for you." The moment he finished reading it, William reportedly stood still for several long seconds, staring at nothing. Then, in a voice that left no room for negotiation, he uttered 6 words that would tear through royal protocol like a sword through silk. "She's not going. Not this time." There was no discussion, no debate, no compromise. In a monarchy built on silent unity, William's decision shattered the illusion. And though the public didn't know it yet, the summit would proceed without the Queen Consort. The world was about to witness the fallout of a secret long buried and a crown no longer willing to look the other way. But what exactly did the Queen write that sent shockwaves through her own bloodline? And why did William act with such finality? The late Queen was known for her discretion, but her personal writings reveal a storm beneath the calm. What she documented about Camilla would have changed the course of history, if only it had come to light sooner. Tucked within the sealed folds of the royal archives, the Queen's memo had remained untouched for nearly 2 years, silent, patient, and devastating. Its contents weren't meant for public eyes, nor even for most members of the royal family. It was written in her unmistakable script, dated in the spring of her final years, and addressed without formality, simply for future guidance. Yet behind that veil of royal calm was a torrent of unspoken doubt. Her words weren't vindictive. They were methodical, measured, and deeply personal. The Queen, stoic to the end, had left behind something far more potent than public speeches or staged appearances: her unfiltered judgment. In the pages, Queen Elizabeth raised concerns that had never been voiced aloud in any official capacity. She spoke of Camilla's public temperament, a term royal watchers would later interpret as code for unpredictability. She pointed to inconsistencies in Camilla's behind-the-scenes conduct and referenced private reports detailing moments of friction with palace staff, foreign guests, and even close family members. These were not the gentle observations of an aging monarch. They were stark warnings written in confidence. But it was the mention of influence that truly sent a chill down William's spine. The Queen outlined what she described as unsettling patterns of Camilla's connections to foreign dignitaries and select lobbying groups whose interests, she feared, could conflict with the monarchy's neutral standing. While no accusations were directly made, the implication was unmistakable. Camilla, in the Queen's eyes, it was too close to forces beyond the palace gates, forces that might one day steer the crown away from its duty to the people. Perhaps the most damning passage was her reflection on what she feared would be a looming shift in public representation. In a line underlined twice, The Queen wrote, "A power shift may soon occur that does not reflect the will of the people." Though she never used names, her comparison was unmistakable. Just paragraphs later, she praises Catherine's quiet strength, her restraint under pressure, and her unwavering alignment with the Crown's values. "If the face of Britain is to be presented to the world," she noted, "it must be one of grace, stability, and generational trust." Then came the final line, the one William would later repeat to his closest aides like a mantra. "In matters of legacy," she wrote, "presence must follow loyalty." A sentence so simple, yet so heavy, it pierced through centuries of royal tradition in an instant. The Queen had made her feelings clear, not in a speech, not in a law, but in a final, private act of guidance. And for William, those words didn't just echo, they roared. Once William read those final words, everything changed, and Camilla's world began to unravel. Behind palace walls, William's face was unreadable, but his decision was absolute. The Queen had spoken from the grave, and her words demanded action, even if it meant going against his father's wife. For William, the battle was never just about protocol. It was about his grandmother's legacy, the Crown's integrity, and the future he was destined to inherit. In the hours after reading the Queen's chilling final memo, he wasn't just a son or a prince, he was a protector, thrust into a moment of reckoning he hadn't anticipated but could no longer avoid. The silence around him was deafening, but inside, a storm had already begun. He remembered moments when Camilla subtly but deliberately overshadowed Catherine at public events. The way she'd step ahead in photos, interrupt conversations meant for the Duchess, or brush off Catherine's quiet dignity with veiled sarcasm. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns, and the Queen had seen them too. What cut the deepest wasn't Camilla's behavior. It was the slow erosion of something sacred. The monarchy, William knew, thrived on image and unity. Every step, every gesture, every word meticulously curated to project continuity. But recently, that image has begun to crack. Whispers grew louder, headlines grew bolder, and the public, once unified in reverence, now questioned what they were witnessing. William feared this summit would be the final fracture, a stage where Camilla, emboldened by position, would speak not as a servant of the crown, but as a power unto herself. That, to him, was unacceptable. The meeting with King Charles was brief, less than 20 minutes. Aides described the atmosphere as ice-cold, with barely a word exchanged after William stated his position. Charles, caught between his loyalty to his wife and the son who would one day wear his crown, sat motionless. William did not beg. He did not argue. He simply cited the Queen's own words and ended with, "The crown must come first. Always." There was no emotional plea, just a line drawn in stone. To William, this wasn't personal, it was preservation. The summit wasn't a family gathering, it was an international event broadcast to the world, representing centuries of royal tradition. Allowing Camilla to attend, in the wake of the Queen's grave warning, would be a betrayal not just of Elizabeth's memory, but of everything she had built. William made it clear, this was not a moment for compromise. It was a line in the sand, one he was prepared to defend at all costs. He authorized his staff to begin preparations for a royal appearance without Camilla's name attached. He issued a quiet directive. Catherine would stand beside him, representing the monarchy with poise, grace, and the legitimacy inherited from both duty and respect. There would be backlash. There would be tension, but none of that mattered anymore. The Queen had chosen her words carefully. Now, William would choose his actions just as precisely. As William made his move, Camilla's camp went into damage control, and what followed was an emotional spiral the royals couldn't hide. Camilla was no stranger to scandal, but never had she been publicly sidelined by William. Sources say she broke down, screaming one phrase over and over, "She did this to me from the grave." The moment the news reached Camilla, it wasn't delivered with the gentleness one might expect for a queen. A royal aide, visibly shaken, handed her the final itinerary for the summit. Her name was omitted. No title, no mention, just an empty space where the queen consort's presence was once guaranteed. She stared at the document for several seconds before the room exploded with rage. It wasn't just exclusion, it was an exile. In her eyes, a calculated, deliberate blow delivered not just by William, but orchestrated by the ghost of a woman who had never fully accepted her place at the throne, Queen Elizabeth. The walls of Clarence's house could barely contain the echo of her fury. Staff members whispered of doors slamming, crystal shattering, and a repeated unrelenting phrase, "She did this to me from the grave." Her composure, honed over years of criticism and quiet manipulation, collapsed entirely. This wasn't the poised, polished consort the world saw on balcony appearances. This was a woman unraveling under the weight of rejection not just from the future king, but from the legacy of the one monarch who had reluctantly given her space. That space was now being clawed back, piece by piece. In her spiral, Camilla's rage turned sharply toward Catherine. She became convinced the leak had not happened by chance, that the timing, the optics, and even the Queen's memo being found at this precise moment were all part of a deeper plot to remove her from power. She accused aides of conspiring, demanded names, and whispered to those closest to her that the Princess of Wales was behind it all. She saw Catherine not just as a rising figure, but as a threat who had waited patiently to deliver the final, silent strike. But it wasn't just Catherine. Tensions long buried resurfaced in Camilla's memory, particularly her long-standing discomfort with Princess Anne. The Queen's only daughter had never been subtle in her disdain. And now, with Anne's close relationship to William and rumored involvement in managing royal archives, Camilla began to question if this was a united front, a coordinated effort to erase her influence and replace her with a more palatable face, one who wore Diana's legacy without resistance. The breaking point came in a confrontation with Charles. Camilla, emotionally exhausted and furious, demanded answers. "You promised I would stand beside you," she spat, holding the summit itinerary like a weapon. Charles stood silent, unsure whether to defend her or support his son. Bound by duty and torn by love, he was powerless. William had not defied protocol. He had enforced the Queen's words. To contradict him now would risk fracturing the monarchy from within. And so, Charles said nothing. That silence hit Camilla harder than any word could. Her isolation was complete. But while Camilla struggled privately, the public was about to be exposed to the one thing she feared most: a summit without her. In a shocking breach of royal tradition, Camilla's chair remained empty at the international summit, and in her place stood someone whose presence reignited the people's faith in the monarchy, Catherine. The official summit itinerary hit the press like a thunderclap. Hours before the event, media outlets scrambled to confirm what they thought must have been an oversight, but it wasn't. Camilla's name was gone, erased without explanation, and in its place, a last-minute substitution. Catherine, Princess of Wales. No formal announcement, no press release, just a silent change that spoke louder than any public statement ever could. And with that, the summit, already anticipated as a historic gathering of world leaders, was transformed into something far more symbolic. The crown had made its choice, not with words, but with presence. Cameras snapped furiously as Catherine stepped onto the summit floor, every movement exuding quiet command. She hadn't been expected to represent the monarchy that day, but there she stood, graceful, dignified, composed. In that moment, the global stage shifted. Heads of state leaned in, conversations grew warmer, and royal observers noted a striking detail. Catherine's attire carried subtle nods to Queen Elizabeth's muted colors, pearls, and a brooch long associated with the late monarch's most pivotal public appearances. It was not accidental. It was a message. The monarchy wasn't just enduring, it was evolving. International outlets ran with it instantly. "The Crown speaks through Catherine," declared one headline. Another wrote, "In Catherine, we see Elizabeth again." For years, speculation swirled about who would carry the legacy forward. But now, without a word spoken, the public had their answer. Catherine wasn't simply a consort in waiting. She was the embodiment of everything the monarchy needed in the eyes of the world: restraint, strength, and legitimacy unshaken by personal ambition. Meanwhile, just miles away, Camilla watched the summit unfold on screen from Windsor. Her humiliation was complete. This wasn't just a political snub. It was a visual exile. Every handshake Catherine offered, every world leader she addressed, every approving nod from diplomats, each one twisted the knife a little deeper. And for Camilla, the betrayal didn't feel strategic. It felt personal. She wasn't simply absent. She had been replaced. The symbolism couldn't be ignored. One woman had been removed, another elevated, and at the heart of it all, a silent memo from a queen who had once struggled to accept Camilla. now casting a shadow larger in death than she ever did in life. Catherine's presence didn't just fill a gap, it redefined it. The summit had been intended as a demonstration of unity. Instead, it became a mirror, reflecting where the real lines of power had shifted. But the summit was only the beginning. Camilla now wanted answers, and what she uncovered led her to the one woman she blamed the most. There's one royal who's never been afraid to say the unspeakable: Princess Anne. When Camilla cornered her in the Windsor Gardens, what followed was a brutal truth exchange that shattered decades of silence. Camilla didn't bother with pleasantries, she went straight to the point, fueled by humiliation and rage. Her voice was sharp, her words loaded, demanding to know who had leaked the Queen's private memo, and why she, the Queen consort, had been cast aside in favor of someone who wasn't even born into royalty. But Anne, as always, didn't flinch. She stood her ground with the same icy calm that had made her the monarchy's most unshakable pillar for decades. Her response was chilling in its clarity. That memo was meant for William, not you. And you were never supposed to see it. The air between them shifted. Camilla's face, once defiant, flickered with something that looked like fear. Because Anne wasn't speculating, she knew. And in her tone was a buried truth, too long ignored. Queen Elizabeth had feared this exact moment. Not the scandal, not the headlines, but the day when ambition would overtake service. When power would be worn like a crown of entitlement, rather than one of duty. Anne didn't accuse Camilla directly. She didn't need to. Her pointed silence was more powerful than any allegation. Camilla, rattled but not defeated, pushed back harder. She threatened to go public to tell her side, expose the family's manipulations, and let the world know what she believed had really been going on. But Anne didn't blink. Instead, she delivered the coldest line of the encounter. Then you'll expose your own undoing. It was a dare masked as wisdom, a warning rooted in knowledge Anne had guarded for years. She knew that the Queen had long harbored concerns about Camilla's influence behind closed doors. She knew the fragile trust given to Camilla had never been complete. And she knew the public was not nearly as forgiving as Camilla believed. Then, without raising her voice or showing emotion, Anne reminded Camilla of something far more brutal than any press headline. She brought up the past decades-old bitterness that had never truly healed. Diana's name wasn't spoken, but it hovered in the air, thick and unspoken. Anne remembered the pain, the betrayal, the headlines that nearly broke the crown once before. To her, this wasn't just about the summit. It was about history trying to repeat itself and her refusal to let it. And then, as if to end the confrontation with finality, Anne turned away with one last sentence. The crown doesn't bend for resentment. It was a blow that cut deeper than any tabloid ever could. Because for Camilla, resentment had become the currency of her survival. And now, it was the very thing, stripping her of everything she had fought to claim. But Camilla wasn't the only one shaken by the fallout. William's choice had opened an unexpected crack between him and his father. The monarch and his heir, bound by duty, but now divided by a woman's absence. King Charles didn't raise his voice, but his silence after the summit spoke volumes. And William felt the weight. After the summit concluded, and the headlines declared Catherine the new symbol of royal continuity, there was no congratulations, no fatherly embrace, not even a private word of acknowledgement. Charles walked past William in the corridor of St. James's with a blank expression, hands clasped behind his back. The same man who had once whispered to Camilla, "My darling, you'll be by my side no matter what," now walked like a ghost through the aftermath of a public sidelining he didn't sanction. And William, who had prepared himself for political backlash, hadn't prepared for this, the quiet, searing disappointment of a father who felt betrayed without speaking a single word. But regret never crossed William's face. The pain was real, yes, but not the doubt. The Queen's memo had given him the clarity he needed. His decision was rooted not in rebellion, but in reverence for tradition, for his grandmother's foresight, and for the monarchy's long-term survival. Still, the images from months earlier played in his mind. He recalled the day of Charles's coronation, the way his father had defended Camilla's role with conviction, the way he'd silenced critics with carefully chosen words. She has earned her place. That memory now clashed violently with the present silence, a silence that felt more like a sentence than a statement. The tension between father and son reached its boiling point at a private family dinner days later. It was meant to be a gathering for appearances, to present a united front. but the chill in the room was unmistakable. Charles barely touched his meal. He said nothing to William, and when Catherine tried to bridge the divide with polite conversation, Charles stood up, placed his napkin on the table, and left without a word. No royal temper, no explosive outburst, just the unmistakable signal that something inside the king had cracked, and it wasn't going to be repaired easily. Alone in the quiet that followed, William was left with a question that had haunted every heir since the dawn of monarchies. When blood and principle collide, which must lead? His father was not just a monarch, he was a man bound by a marriage that William believed was now endangering the public's trust. But that man was also his father, and that truth made the silence cut deeper than any public criticism ever could. Catherine, ever the anchor, urged him not to waver. In a private moment between the two, she reminded him of the Queen's words, especially the last. In matters of legacy, presence must follow loyalty. That sentence had become their compass. Catherine believed, as William did, that standing firm now meant ensuring the crown's survival later. And though William didn't say it aloud, he knew that the divide between him and his father might never fully close. And just as tensions simmered within the family, an outside force made things worse. One, the Queen had long feared, would try to seize the narrative. Whispers of foreign influence suddenly gained traction. A diplomatic leak linked Camilla to foreign benefactors who had long sought access through royal ties. And Queen Elizabeth may have seen it coming all along. What had started as a domestic scandal quickly spiraled into something far more dangerous. International media outlets began publishing a string of quiet but piercing headlines, suggesting that Camilla's presence at the summit wasn't just symbolic. It would have signaled a subtle but unmistakable alignment with foreign interests. The timing was too perfect to ignore. Just as the Queen's memo re-emerged, a parallel leak surfaced. An anonymous letter, allegedly written by a former embassy official, claiming Camilla had been engaged in a series of unreported talks with select cultural envoys tied to non-Commonwealth nations. Meetings that, on the surface, seemed benign dinners, charity events, and private receptions. But the tone of the letter was unmistakable. These were not mere social niceties. They were entry points, doors being opened where walls had once stood firm. The Queen's memo, once read as personal disapproval, now took on a far more strategic light. Buried in her words was a line that had once seemed abstract, but now rang like a warning bell. Unfit for sovereignty is the presence entangled with external intent. Those weren't just musings. They were a red flag waving from beyond the grave. William, already grappling with internal tension, now faced something bigger than family loyalty. He was staring down a geopolitical risk, one that could drag the monarchy into a game it was never meant to play. Behind the scenes, British intelligence briefed senior palace officials. The reports weren't definitive, but they were damning enough to warrant attention. The optics, they warned, were shifting. Public trust in the monarchy was always delicately balanced, and the slightest suggestion of compromise of royal doors being opened to foreign agendas could send that trust into a freefall. The monarchy couldn't afford ambiguity. Not now, not ever. William was briefed personally. When handed the intelligence summary, he said only one thing to his security advisor. This was never just about her. That sentence echoed through the walls of Kensington like a thunderclap. To those close to him, it became clear this wasn't about personal resentment or family vendettas anymore. It was about containment, about control, about protecting an institution that had already survived scandals, wars, and centuries of evolution. If the crown was to continue, it could not be used. Not for personal connections, not for outside gain, and certainly not for quiet influence under the guise of charity and diplomacy. As more details emerged, the Queen's final words, once debated as too subtle, too cryptic, were now heralded as prophetic. Her reluctance, her hesitation, her late-stage caution regarding Camilla was not rooted in emotion. It was tactical, it was protective, and above all, it was right. As the outside pressure mounted, William was left with a choice: stay quiet or make his final move public. The decision would change everything. Standing before the cameras, William didn't mention Camilla by name, but the world knew who his words were meant for. He spoke for the Queen, for the crown, and for the future of a monarchy reborn. The palace courtyard was silent, save for the flicker of cameras and the subtle anticipation of the press. When William stepped forward to deliver his statement, there were no frantic gestures or dramatic pauses, just a calm, composed air who had carried the burden of generational duty into a moment that would define the future. What he said didn't call out scandal, it didn't name names. But in its precision, its poise, and its undertone, it made one thing unmistakably clear. This was a new chapter, written in the shadow of the Queen's wisdom and sealed by William's resolve. He began by invoking her memory, calling her the crown's compass and conscience, and praised what he referred to as the enduring wisdom she left not only in words, but in principles. His voice did not shake. He stood unflinching as he reaffirmed his allegiance not to titles, not to hierarchy, but to something deeper, representation, guided by loyalty, not rank. It was a line that cut with royal sharpness. And while it never said Camilla's name, it unmistakably carved her absence into the conversation. The world didn't need a name. The world had already filled in the blank. Within hours, confirmation came from official channels. Camilla would not be attending any diplomatic events for the remainder of the year. The decision, though framed as part of a restructuring of royal duties, was a quiet dethroning from the realm of global influence. Her retreat from the spotlight wasn't an exile. It was a deliberate recalibration, sanctioned by the future king, and, in the eyes of many, guided by the spirit of the Queen herself. Meanwhile, Catherine's presence was no longer just ceremonial. Her performance at the summit had captured international attention, drawing praise from leaders, diplomats, and citizens alike. She had become, in essence, the monarchy's most trusted ambassador, graceful, firm, and untarnished by the politics swirling around her. What began as a substitution was now seen as a transition, and the Queen's once private words were now considered, by royal watchers and historians alike, the monarchy's unspoken rulebook. The public didn't riot. They nodded. Quietly. They understood what had happened. And more importantly, they understood why. Camilla's era as a diplomatic figure had ended not in scandal, but in subtle exclusion, the kind that only the crown can orchestrate with such finality. Newspapers dubbed it the end of Camilla's diplomatic reign, while insiders simply called it the Windsor shift. For William, it wasn't a victory. It was an obligation fulfilled. And as silence returned to the palace halls, one truth lingered when the Queen spoke, even from the grave. The crown listened. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.